Mafia 3 is one of gaming's real tragedies. It had an impossible task of being developed by a first-time studio, Hangar 13 Games, as a big-budget sequel to an only moderately popular series of games. It strove to do something truly brave and different in a market that punishes originality and passion, and it was being developed as an open-world game, right smack in the middle of the 2015 backlash against open-world games. Even with all of the odds stacked against it, Mafia 3 ended up being a wildly compelling and engaging game. To see this happen to the studio responsible hurts, and to see the kind of passionless hand-waving about the studio's fate only rubs salt in the wound, because this is a studio that showed so much promise. Mafia 3 is a game that I love and I truly believe in. It's one of the best open-world crime games ever made that puts its competitors to shame in certain areas. It's got a novel and interesting setting yet unexplored by contemporary games, and it has some of the best performance work and writing from the past few years. In this video, I want to break down why the game is such a resounding success in my view, and directly address common criticisms of the game, and then break down why it failed to capture the attention or admiration of the gaming public. Now, there are flaws in Mafia 3, and I'm not going to be disingenuous and neglect to mention them. I absolutely will be pointing out flaws, but the overall package of Mafia 3 is something that I really do appreciate. There will be full spoilers for the game, as I need to cite specific examples to demonstrate my points, so I recommend that if you haven't played Mafia 3 yet, please do so first. For those left, we're going to start with the setting. Open-world crime games have a pretty long-lasting legacy ever since GTA 3 hit the scene back in 2001. It blew open the possibilities of video games, introducing for the first time a semi-realistic open world with living NPCs, drivers, and systems of chaos that smashed all of its elements together in ways that were unthinkable at the time. Ever since, the open-world crime genre has been dominated by GTA 3 and its many sequels. There's a few series that sprung up as competitors, such as Sleeping Dogs, Just Cause, and Watch Dogs. However, the most notable has been the Mafia series. Mafia set out to create an open-world game more orderly and focused than its competitors, which focused on grand destruction and chaos. Mafia was set in the 1930s and 40s, contrasting it from the contemporary setting of Grand Theft Auto. It was a game not about the open world and the activities that took place within it, but a classic gangster story about the consequences of a life of crime. It was a much more focused, linear experience where the open world was treated as set dressing to move the player from mission to mission. It cemented the series as a unique brand. Years later, Mafia 2 was released and it mostly followed suit, only improving over the original in every way. Mafia 2 is one of gaming's few cult favorites that never quite hit the mainstream, but has passionate memories from everyone who played it. Mafia 2 was instead set in the 1940s and 50s, and also used its open world as more of a way to immerse the player in its world between linear story missions instead of the main focus of the gameplay. Mafia 2 is a wonderful game and one of my favorites. Its more linear story that takes place over a period of years allows the game to have some unique elements among games. The gap of years between chapters allows the world to change and feel alive, and the tightly directed story is one of the better in open world games. It was many years since Mafia 2 was released that news of a third game finally began to surface. It would be a completely different setting than the first two, which were largely familiar Mafia settings of the first half of the 20th century. Mafia 3 would be set in New Bordeaux, a fictional version of New Orleans, and it would take place in the historically important year 1968 during the Civil Rights Movement. This was completely new territory for games. Most open-world crime games take place in New York or LA. The bravest open-world setting before this was maybe Miami, in Vice City, or Hong Kong for Sleeping Dogs, but overall, the game industry had stuck to the safe and the familiar: New York, LA, Chicago. Having a game take place in the Deep South in one of the most tumultuous years in American history was impossibly exciting. The open world of Mafia 3 portrays the Deep South brilliantly. The scorching heat and dripping humidity of the South comes through intensely, and the city is vast and varied through its numerous districts. There's 9 districts total in Mafia 3. Lincoln's home, the Hollow, the poor, predominantly African-American district, River Row for shipping and cargo, Point Verdun, more of an older community with comfy shops and parks, Tickfaw Harbor, a water town, South Downs, the wealthier center of the city, downtown, filled with construction and white-collar areas, Barkley Mills, the industrial center of the city, and Frisco Fields, the wealthy white suburbs. Each district looks distinct visually and gives the city its own character. There is also a large swampy area at the bottom of the map called the Bayou, which contains moonshine stills and marijuana drops. The city feels vibrant and real with these varied districts and ensures the game's visuals aren't repetitive. The city is in the middle of one of the most tumultuous years in American history, 1968. This is the year where the civil rights movement peaked, when Martin Luther King was assassinated, and most importantly, taking place during the Vietnam War. The player character is Lincoln Clay, a veteran returning home from fighting overseas to the local criminals he knows as family. Lincoln is nothing like the other protagonist in the Mafia series up to this point. Both Tommy and Vito were portrayed as good people at heart who were seduced into a life of crime but still remained good at the core until they met their tragic ends. They killed people and broke the law, but they were still treated as good people at the end of it all. Lincoln has the capacity to do good in him, but his experience in Vietnam and the events of the first section of the game turn him into a monster. Lincoln fought overseas as a soldier before he was handpicked by a seedy Black Ops operator named Donovan. He trained Lincoln to participate in high-risk missions against the Viet Cong and the NVA. When Lincoln first returns, everything appears relatively normal. He's genuinely happy to see his friends, and it's after he meets Sal Marcano, the Don of the Italian Mafia in New Bordeaux, that things begin to heat up. Lincoln is part of a heist of the Union Depository with Marcano's son Georgie and a couple more of Lincoln's friends.
I'm robbing people with a 6-gun.
I fought the law, and the law can kiss my ass.
I fought the law and the law lost.
The heist is a success, but during the ensuing celebration, Sal Marcano and his goons come to collect. Lincoln is shot in the head, and he is forced to watch all of his friends die and the bar he grew up in burn down. Lincoln survives but is never the same. The monster he became in Vietnam is unleashed, and he chooses to direct it square at Sal Marcano's organization. A revenge tale isn't anything unique. It's actually a very overplayed and tiresome trope that goes all the way back from Max Payne to Watch Dogs, but Mafia 3 structures its revenge in a way that I haven't really seen any other game do before. This is not a fast and loose tale of rapid plot developments, crazy action, and revelations. This is a long, protracted, and orderly revenge. Father James finds Lincoln in the burning bar, rescues him, and ends up calling Donovan, Lincoln's CIA contact. Donovan helps Lincoln enact his revenge in the same way Lincoln did things over in Vietnam, by slowly and methodically taking over the city piece by piece. Lincoln doesn't just want to kill Sal, he wants to take everything away from him until there is nothing left.
This isn't about bringing them back, or even exacting some street justice. It's about making that bastard feel what it's like to lose everything. Watch as I take it all away from him.
This is a one-way road, Lincoln. And once you start down it, there ain't no turning back.
I'm going to Sammy's to get my stuff. You ready?
I'll be waiting in the car.
Taught us kids to turn the other cheek, not fight back. Problem is that don't work. Not in the real world.
When raindrops fall, you feel low.
This is when Mafia 3's gameplay shifts dramatically away from what a lot of players may have expected from the previous games and from the first few hours of the game. The first few hours of the game have a good pace between minor story missions and the set piece of the Union Depository heist. It's pretty similar to the first two games' pacing, which would have been welcome for series veterans. It's once Lincoln's revenge starts that the cutscenes and story developments become much more spread out. Lincoln's main goal for the rest of the game is to take over Marcano's rackets and hand them off to his 3 underbosses. There's 9 districts in Mafia 3 and each has 2 rackets. To complete a racket, the player has to do enough damage to draw the racket boss out of hiding and then eliminate him. Repeat objectives consist of taking out enforcers and interrogating gangsters for information on an auxiliary objective. This is where one of the main criticisms of the game comes into play. Mafia 3 was heavily criticized for repetitive gameplay. With 2 rackets and 9 districts to take over, you have to do these objectives 18 times throughout the game.
You see, there are 9 districts in this city, not counting the Bayou, and every single one of them plays exactly the same. You talk to a yellow diamond, Donovan, to start. He tells you to talk to 2 different people in that district, which unlocks 2 different colors of missions, say pink and red. Now, these pink and red missions are both causing around $50,000 worth of damage to Marcano's operations. You do this by interrogating targets, blowing up crates, or killing enforcers. Every single time, with no variation. That's it.
But this is a painfully simplistic view of the way the game structures itself and misses that Mafia 3 has many ways of varying this core loop of taking over rackets. Each racket in the game is unique. From prostitution to blackmail to auto theft, each racket does contain unique objectives to each individual racket. In prostitution, the main objective is to save prostitutes from their locked rooms within a brothel. In blackmail, you have to follow around money couriers to find the main stash in a decadent bathhouse. In auto theft, destroy a shipment of boosted exotic cars. In construction, destroy a construction site. In sex, hunt down exotic sex freaks. Ew. Each racket follows suit. It's true that each racket contains minor objectives that remain the same, killing enforcers and interrogations, but this is missing that each racket has a major objective more unique to the racket and the district it takes place in. The minor objectives also aren't nearly as bad as they are criticized for because of their relative brevity. Killing an enforcer takes about 30 seconds. You drive up to their location, kill them and their 3 or 4 bodyguards, and then move on. It's not a protracted, tedious objective repeated over and over again. It's quick enough to kill much of the tedium, and, in most districts, this particular objective isn't even required. Each racket requires a total net sum of damage caused to the racket to draw the boss out of hiding. The player does not have to do every objective to do enough damage. Killing enforcers only gives you a few $1,000s of damage, not even close to the total amount needed to draw out the boss. The major objectives in each area, the good ones, the hunting down body disposal units or saving human trafficking victims, are the ones that dole out the most damage to the racket. This means that the player only needs to do the major objective in each racket as well as maybe 1 enforcer to draw out the boss. Completion is not mandatory, and that's another decision that kills much of the tedium. If the criticism was to be made that these missions are superfluous and do not contribute to the overall plot, then you'd have a stronger argument there. There is no dialogue with side characters or any development made that directly affects the overall plot. There isn't a lot of context. But I'd argue that if you've got a solid gameplay loop, an overwhelming amount of context isn't really necessary. In a time-sensitive story, this would be a pacing disaster. But Mafia 3 smartly designed its story around the bulk of the game. It's an orderly, block-by-block guerrilla takeover of the entire city's criminal underworld, and it develops with a deliberate slowness. There are repetitive elements to these missions, surely. They all share the same overall structure, but I thoroughly and unequivocally disagree that these missions are repetitive in their design. They have a brisk pace and more than enough variation to avoid tedium. What also saves it is the mechanics, which are uncommonly good for a game of this type. The closest competitor, Grand Theft Auto, has really flat and almost automatic shooting with heavy auto aim and very little recoil or player input on its weapons. It's fun because of the spectacle, but the mechanics have always been very weak in Grand Theft Auto games. Mafia 3 is one of the only games of its type whose mechanics could still work outside of the open world crime genre and does in its more linear DLC. The shooting is tight and satisfying. Shotguns send enemies careening through the air and then wriggling on the ground in agony. Some even have to be finished off, adding to the brutality and the shocking violence of Lincoln's crime spree. Headshots have a satisfying pop and a cloud of blood that erupts from exploded heads. The sound effects are just perfect. The gwish of shotgun blasts and the distant echo of gunshots sound pitch perfect in the action.
Got nowhere to go!
Stealth kills are your typical pre-animated takedowns, but this ain't no Deus Ex where you're not supposed to kill people. The stealth kills are brutal and consist of Lincoln ripping into people with his survival knife. It even goes one step further with brutal executions that can be activated by stunning and then holding down the melee button. These are some of the most savage finishers that I've ever seen in a game. One is Lincoln literally plunging his oversized survival knife into some unlucky bastard's face over and over again, crunch after sickening crunch until their face is nothing but ground stew. It's easy to become desensitized to video game violence, but Mafia 3 is one of the few games with a level of violence that hits the perfect balance between over-the-top gore and realism to really drive home how much of an uncaged monster Lincoln really is. Mafia 3 is often criticized as a bog-standard third-person shooter, and while this is true in some respects, brutal executions are actually an example of Mafia 3 using unique mechanics to encourage aggression. Whenever a brutal execution is activated, all nearby enemies will flee or stop shooting for a few seconds. This encourages the player to get out of cover and pull off brutal executions in a pinch. Mafia 3's AI works towards a similar goal by being extremely aggressive themselves depending on weapon type. Criminals armed with shotguns will stride right towards the player or flank if the player is under suppressing fire. Enemies also love to throw Molotovs, which can destroy cover and encourage the player to be mobile. It's nothing groundbreaking, but it does have a subtle effect on the way I play, which is close-range shotgun aggression and brutal executions as much as possible. You can stealth through most combat encounters, but the stealth system is very underwhelming and shares the problems of general pseudo-stealth. It's basic line-of-sight detection and pre-animated takedowns. A big problem is that a lot of the animations are slow and move the player forward dramatically, which has a habit of getting the player spotted. The whistle move is also stupidly overpowered and can be used to wipe out almost every racket in the game with enough patience. A lot of games have adopted this play-it-your-way style of either going in guns blazing or silently killing everybody, but usually this ends up just diluting both styles of gameplay into something mediocre. Mafia 3 certainly fails in compelling stealth gameplay, but its combat is very strong and remains satisfying throughout the game. It's also one of the few games of its type to understand the importance of personal customization, although certainly not on release. Even in GTA, it becomes impractical to customize and drive your own car outside of the online mode because of the monetary cost and the unintuitive mechanics to regain your car after missions. In Mafia 3, you can unlock cars from completing districts and then call them in whenever you want in just a few seconds. It's awesome to drive your own personal car for the majority of the game instead of just grabbing the nearest station wagon across the road. The cars in Mafia 3 control very differently from the floaty physics of GTA or the magnetized to the ground feel of Saints Row. This is long enough ago when cars were made out of steel instead of fiberglass, and the cars really feel like it. You can really feel the weight of cars in Mafia 3, from the slow, deliberate acceleration to the creaking of turns to the ear-shattering collision of metal and crashes. They feel appropriate for the era and give the game's driving a unique feel. You can also customize unlocked cars with paint jobs, body kits including spoilers and splitters, decals, and actual engine tuning upgrades that changes either the acceleration or top speed. You can also switch your outfits, which include full combat gear, a suit and tie, and this sweet racing jacket which I wore for almost the entire game. I'm sure some of you are looking at what I'm showing here and suspect I might have hacked the game or I'm using mods to have some of this in the game. No, Unfortunately, one of Mafia 3's largest problems is that all of this stuff was patched in the game later, much later after the game's release, which left a very poor impression on players who bought the game early. I've played Mafia 3 twice. First time was a couple months after the game was released at the time when some of these outfits were patched in, and the second time was just recently after the 3 story DLC had been released. On my first playthrough, I didn't have access to the car customization, and it was a real weak spot in the game having to drive the same color car through the whole thing. Only on my most recent playthrough does the game finally feel complete. I'm going to elaborate on this problem later. The more legitimate criticisms of repetition is that the game reuses locations and most rackets for the boss encounter. The bathhouse I mentioned earlier is used for the major objective in the racket for stealing the money stash, and then is reused for the boss encounter. This is lazier than it should be, and seeing the place scrubbed clean and items back in their original spots after the player cleared it out earlier does a disservice to the player's actions and makes it feel meaningless. The game is also criticized for using the same animation for each boss encounter, and while this was true on release, new animations have been patched in later, and that is just such a minor issue. So we've explored how this common criticism has a bit more depth than most critics seem to mention, but the most frustrating thing about these criticisms is that there are actually examples of shameless repetitive mission design in Mafia 3. They just aren't the ones the press refers to. Mafia 3's optional missions to raise the urn of each underboss are terrible. There are 3 types: drive all the way down to the bayou and drive a boat about a third of the way back, and then drive a truck all the way back to the racket. Drive all the way down to the bayou and return with a semi-truck, or drive all the way down to the bayou and return with a moonshine truck. That's it, and you have to do these multiple times each if you want to raise the max urn of each underboss. These get even worse for Burke's optional missions, where you have to get 3 cars each all the way across the city, and this is a mission you have to do 5 times throughout the game if you want to complete Burke's storyline. The one saving grace is that these missions are technically optional, even though they do contain rewards for doing them. I said at the beginning of the video that I love Mafia 3, and that is the truth, but these missions are the one part of the game that are indefensibly bad and show what I think has to be either laziness or lack of time from the developers. These can be made more bearable by spreading them out and doing just one at a time, but doing multiple of these in a row is an exercise in madness. Overall, though, I find the relentless and prevalent criticism of Mafia 3's repetitive gameplay unbelievably hypocritical and confusing coming from the game's press. How many other open-world games use similar gameplay structures? Assassin's Creed, Watch Dogs, Far Cry, basically any Ubisoft game is just as, if not more so, repetitively designed than Mafia 3, and they seem to skirt by without any points docked off for this. The games press seems to hold Mafia 3 to a higher standard than it does other open world games, and the real irony is that while Mafia 3 was unfairly singled out as the one open world game with repetitive gameplay, it's actually one of the better ones because of its successful attempts at variation. Assassin's Creed side missions are literally the same 3 missions repeated dozens of times throughout the game. Far Cry has you climbing radio towers and taking copy-pasted outposts throughout the game, and Far Cry 3 ended up with glowing reviews. I enjoy some of the Far Cry games and Assassin's Creed games, but they are just as, if not more, repetitive than Mafia 3, not less. I normally don't pay much attention to game reviews, but I can't help but think the mixed reception to Mafia 3 contributed in some part to the layoffs the studio suffered, and that makes the short-sightedness of the games press incredibly frustrating. So what about those special immersive sim elements that elevate the game mechanically beyond a regular open-world crime game? Well, Mafia 3 has those too, just as Mafia 2 did before it. Mafia 2 had police who would behave like real police and relentlessly chase the player across the entire world until nothing remains of their corpse but smoldering remains. Okay, maybe not that, but they would pull the player over for basic traffic violations like speeding and running red lights. Mafia 3 mostly abandons this, unfortunately, but supplements it with its own unique police mechanics. The police response in Mafia 3 reflects the economic status of the district where the crime was committed. If the player commits a crime in the Hollow or River Row, some of the poorer districts, then the police response will be delayed and more casual on the radio response.
Send your officers! Now! If any of y'all in the mood, I got a report of an armed colored boy in the Hollow.
Boss are coming. Here he is. Get up.
If the player commits a crime in one of the wealthier districts like Frisco Fields or downtown, they will be swarmed with cops immediately and have a much more urgent call on the dispatch radio for assistance.
Run reported in Frisco Field. Suspect is described as a colored male. All units, please respond immediately.
Not only does it make the world feel alive and reinforce the cruel reality of the time the game takes place in, but also allows the player flexibility in their actions as they can get away with criminal activity much easier in the lower income districts of the map. It's a brilliant addition that mechanically expresses the societal injustices of the time. Getting back to the rackets, after the player takes out both rackets in a district, the Overboss comes out to play, and these are the more interesting and developed missions with obviously a lot more money put into them. These are all completely unique and sometimes have other characters along for the ride, which is a great way to make Lincoln's Revenge feel like less of a solo venture. The Overboss missions are treated as a sort of big reward after clearing out the rackets. The thing that makes this work is that the time needed to get to these bigger, more climactic missions is relatively short. It takes maybe 20 to 30 minutes to clear out a racket and about an hour to do the whole district. When I hear Mafia 3 described as a relentless grind by game reviewers, I have to wonder what game they were playing. The two best lieutenant missions in the game are Remy Duval and Enzo. Remy Duval is the leader of the Southern Union, Mafia 3's version of the KKK, and also the best racket in the game. The Southern Union is the only racket in the game that requires $90,000 of damage to draw out the boss. It's also the only one where I feel fully compelled to do every objective available. After interrogating a few members like normal, you'll discover that something is going on at the local grocery store in town. After sneaking in at night, you'll realize the awful truth of the Southern Union. They are selling slaves to rich white donors. It's 1968. Slavery has been abolished for more than 100 years. Mafia 3 is a game full of racial cruelty, but this is a whole new level of moral repugnancy. Suddenly, player motivation isn't something that needs complicated storylines to cultivate. The mission to save people from literally being sold as slaves is immediate and visceral. Remy Duval holds a midnight vigil with the Southern Union and provides the best grenade opportunity in the game.
Fuck those unwashed, deep-based, big-lipped, bug-eyed savages who grow fat. None of you saw him go past.
The slow realization that the Southern Union is much worse than you thought, combined with giving the player an opportunity and reason to remorselessly gun down the racist scumbags participating in this, stands as Mafia 3's best racket design. The other lieutenant that really stands out is Enzo, an old-school mobster, simply because this is the only member of Marcano's organization that Lincoln spares. Frank Pagani is the first lieutenant for Lincoln to show some amount of regret for, but Enzo is the first for Lincoln to hold his bloodlust back. I said that Lincoln Clay is a monster, and while this is mostly true, sparing Enzo shows that Lincoln does still have a bit of humanity left in him. All it took for Lincoln to stay his hand was for Enzo to acknowledge that what happened to Sammy was wrong and that Sal Marcano did wrong by Lincoln. That's it. Soon after, Marcano's goons show up, which initiates the best music cue in the game.
Partner to get into trouble.
We should get moving.
Looks like it's a little late for that.
Deal's a deal. Let's go.
And time keeps dragging on.
Pussy ass motherfuckers used to wait for me.
But that train keeps rolling on down the line.
Mafia 3 has maybe the best licensed soundtrack in video game history. It has an outstanding selection of period-appropriate songs, and most importantly, it knows how to use them. There's your classic Vietnam-era songs like Paint It Black and Fortunate Son, but the game has a shocking amount of variety. It's got classic R&B artists Sam Cooke, The Temptations, and The Supremes, and even has some good country and more folksy songs like The Wait and Folsom Prison Blues, as well as the classic You Belong to Me by the Duprees. These are all on the radio and are a blast to listen to, as well as give the game a great sense of time and place. But the best thing about the soundtrack is the numerous music cues throughout the game that seamlessly bleed into action sequences.
Fuck.
Those are Marcano's guys. Cocksucker. Come on, back to the car. You drive. I'll cover us. Fuck, if that little prick gets away. Ha! Ha!
Without you.
It's either this or right away in some goddamn office. And once you've killed those assholes, you come and find me. I'll be hanging around over at the Padres.
You got it.
You give them hell, champ.
Get you out of the city. Make sure Marcano doesn't find you.
Yeah.
If you want to live through this, stick close to me. You understand?
As I walk along, I wonder what went wrong with us.
I can get us. No.
That was so
We take
strong.
mine.
This boy's mine.
While the lieutenant missions are bigger compared to the rackets, there are some even above those. There's 3 capos in the game, and each has an explosive and decadent mission dedicated to them. To get to Sal's brother Tommy, you have to win a boxing championship, which unfortunately doesn't have the level of polish and mechanics that Mafia 2's prison fights does, but it's still a welcome variation. There's 3 fights you have to win, and these can mostly be won by either countering at the correct time or doing brutal executions, which in this part of the game are non-lethal. Then you have a big shootout in the flaming wreckage of the boxing ring before escaping from the cops. Sal's other brother Lou is the mission heavily promoted by the game's advertising before release, and it's easy to see why. It's hands down the most visually spectacular mission in the game. Lou is taking a state senator on a boat cruise through the bayou, and Lincoln sabotages a nearby crane, which sets the boat aflame and begins sinking. The ensuing fight aboard the ship is insane, and unlike anything I've seen in another game. There is passengers jumping overboard and being devoured by alligators below. The ship is constantly shifting, sending furniture and your aim all over the place, and the lighting of the darkened ship in flames is absolutely gorgeous. The last capo mission is Olivia Marcano, and it's also very high budget and unique. Olivia is hosting a wake for Remy Duval, and Lincoln Clay is there to crash the party. This time, Lincoln disguises himself as a waiter and laces the wine with military-grade LSD prepared by Donovan. It's a great change of pace, and Donovan's inclusion injects a little madness into the mission that works perfectly. Before you can fully take over the city, you first need people to run things. Mafia 3 gives you 3 underbosses to run the territory Lincoln takes back from Marcano. The one tasked to run the Hollow is Cassandra, a Haitian woman Lincoln saves back before the Union Depository heist. Cassandra parallels Lincoln in a lot of ways, bearing the same anger and resentment of the problems of society, also having lost what she tells Lincoln is her sister for the majority of the game. Cassandra seems broken by this, and it's hinted that there may be more going on than she seems to have let on. Her loyalty missions task you with stealing guns from the Dixie Mafia for the people of the Hollow to defend themselves. This seems superfluous, and like the game is making you wade through even more tedious busy work just to appease one of your underbosses, but it turns out there is actually a compelling reason for this. After completing her loyalty missions, she'll reveal that it wasn't her sister that was killed, it was her daughter. Cassandra, her grandmother, and her daughter lived near a Dixie Mafia still when her extremely anti-alcohol grandmother tore up the still in a fit of rage. The Dixie Mafia retaliated and killed Cassandra's family while leaving her to die. She passionately exclaims to Lincoln that if she had a gun, that her daughter would still be alive. It doesn't excuse the poor mission design, but I was surprised that there was actually a compelling story reason behind it all. The next is Thomas Burke, the father of Danny Burke, who helped at the beginning of the Union Depository heist and was then murdered along with Sammy Robinson and Ellis. Burke speaks in a heavy Irish accent and carries a lot of grief from Danny's death. He also has a daughter named Nikki who seems to have a bit of history with Lincoln until she is later revealed as a lesbian and hiding it from her father. After completing Burke's annoying IRA Don't Ask missions, he'll reveal that he has terminal liver cancer and only expects to live another 6 to 8 months. The game also tries to give a reason for the repetitive car collecting, but a much less effective one. It turns out Burke just needed money to get Nikki out of town, apparently not content with what he's been earning. His last act as a father who he feels failed his son is to get Nicky out of the life that claimed his son. Throughout the first few hours of Mafia 3, I was wondering what its connection to Mafia 2 was, and was expecting some hidden Easter eggs that might illuminate the events preceding the end of the game. What I was not expecting was the third underboss, Vito Scaletta, the protagonist from Mafia 2. At the end of Mafia 2, Vito and his best friend Joe were exiled from Empire Bay after they started a war between the Asian and Italian gangs of the city. New Bordeaux is where they sent him. Vito's personal stake in the game is hunting down those responsible for Joe's supposed death at the end of Mafia 2. It's awfully convenient that they are all in New Bordeaux too, and disappointing that there aren't any new cutscenes dedicated to these past characters, but cool to see regardless. When you complete Vito's missions, he'll tell you what happened after the events of Mafia 2, and that he believes Joe is dead for good. Mafia 3's other interesting mechanic is how you dole out territory to your underbosses. If you shaft one underboss too many times, they will eventually turn on Lincoln and force him to kill them. They are thankfully very patient, and as long as you don't have them take over a racket only to give it to somebody else later on, they won't get too mad at you. 3 underbosses and 9 territories divides evenly, but they all have their own upgrade tree, and you can't max out any one boss's upgrade tree if you plan on distributing the territory equally. The upgrade trees are extremely useful in the game and consist of unlocking more and more powerful weapons, upgrades to health and equipment, and special abilities. The special abilities are very useful and consist of hit squads that can be called in for backup, bribing a police response, or shutting off phone lines to avoid reinforcements. The underboss system is great and not only gives the player allies, but incorporates some light decision making and a feel of power in their criminal endeavors. While the games press was overwhelmingly negative about the game's combat and mission design, they were generally positive about the story and writing. Mafia 3's writing and performance work are some of the best of the past few years. There is actual nuance and humanity, a rare thing for any type of media. Father James is possibly the most expressive and lively character in gaming, able to communicate a wide array of emotions non-verbally. He is able to convey real, palpable regret and self-reflection in ways that would have to be done verbally in the past. Father James is the one who calls Donovan at the beginning, placing Lincoln on his path of revenge. The game is told in a documentary style as characters relay decisions they've made in the past. The present Father James is weary and worn down and seems to regret the decision to call Donovan more than anything. He's willing to offer both hope and sympathy, and bitterness and resentment. It's this confliction of character that comes through so strongly in the actor's performance and genuinely jaw-dropping motion capture work.
Marcano.
Lincoln once told me he couldn't turn the other cheek, that the world doesn't work that way. I spent the better part of 40 years trying to prove him wrong. But I was just lying to myself. Look at how we treat each other. Compassion is a sign of weakness, but greed is a virtue. The poor is considered morally corrupt, while every excess of the powerful is celebrated. We sent kids off to die. For what? So someone can make a few bucks? Lincoln was right. He was always right. There ain't never gonna be another Dr. King or a Bobby Kennedy. But there always gonna be another Sal Marcano, another Sammy Robinson, another Lincoln Clay. We are a cruel and wicked people.
The polar opposite of Father James in the story is Donovan, Lincoln's CIA buddy and supplier of information on Marcano's crew throughout the game. He's an arrogant, sociopathic recluse who knows both how to cook up military-grade LSD and paste together a wall of targets with red lines and compiling information on how to find them. He's absolutely bizarre, and his performance and dialogue are magnetic and steal virtually every scene he's in. Donovan and Father James serve as Lincoln's moral anchors, pulling him equally to humanity and reason or to cruelty and greed. But where Mafia 3 really surprised me is in its villains. Some of Mafia 3's villains aren't portrayed as universal bloodlusted monsters. I wouldn't call them sympathetic, but the writers managed to do something even more challenging than going to great lengths to draw sympathy. Some of the villains have believable and reasonable motivations yet still retain their villainy. It's a fine line to walk, but the game chooses to walk that line all the way to the end, and that makes it all the more admirable. Now, it would be unfair to paint all the villains in the same light. The game does have its standard fare of over-the-top villains such as Michael Greco and Tony DiRazio, Greco being a slimeball with no moral compass, and DiRazio being a ruthless, prim and proper businessman who has no tolerance for failure. Usual character archetypes that we've seen before, but are totally functional in the overarching story of the game. Wait, what's this? Where Mafia 3 truly surprises is in its more major villains, the Marcano family. They're criminals, they run drugs, blackmail, prostitutes, auto theft, and even a human disposal racket, yet their motivations are not out of greed and power, and they have rules. Sal Marcano explicitly objects to the sale of heroin in the city because of what it does to people. He runs PCP and hallucinogen rackets, but doesn't believe in hard drugs that destroy people's lives. Given that Marcano has no problem with murder, given what he believes is cause, it's interesting how the well-being of the city seems to be something he actually takes seriously. Sal Marcano has an actual human drive throughout the game. Sal is weary of crime and whose main interest in the game is trying to get gambling legalized so that he can open a casino and go legit, exiting his life of crime with his family intact. His family members in the game have similar conflicts. His brother Tommy runs a boxing ring for black fighters and controls the flow of counterfeit money in Sal's organization. After Lincoln wins the boxing championship, he confronts him, straps him to a chair, and goes into graphic detail about how much the fire he is about to cover Lincoln in is going to hurt.
Before you die, you gonna feel your peck of blood.
But after Lincoln gets the upper hand, he reflects on his choices. Sal wanted Tommy to go to law school and become a lawyer, but the game doesn't launch into a dramatic cutscene detailing the moment Tommy chose to become a criminal or give Tommy his own prequel DLC. It doesn't go too far with this detail and try to establish Tommy as a sympathetic person. He still says fuck you to Lincoln at the end. It's incredibly refreshing to see a game treat its characters with such honesty and not try to paint them in a certain light for the benefit of the plot. Sal's older brother Lou is treated a little differently. Lou Marcano, or Uncle Lou as the populace refers to him, is the party king of New Bordeaux. You'll hear his voice on the radio much longer than you'll interact with him. At first, Lou seems like a harmless, albeit corrupt member of Sal's organization until the fight aboard the boat, where you can hear his carelessness about the crew members' lives when the pressure is on. During the fight on the boat, the player's preconceptions about Lou change dramatically, and that makes Lincoln's revenge all the more satisfying when he leaves his body on a statue of Andrew Jackson. Sal's sister Olivia turns out to be the most conniving of the bunch, responsible for the action that led Sal Marcano to try to leave his life of crime, his brother Lucho's and her husband's death. Olivia is in league with Remy Duval after taking over Lucho's operations, and after infiltrating Duval's wake and killing her guard, she'll reveal a bit of her humanity. Olivia was seduced by the romanticism of criminal life, noting that her late husband Lucho always drove the best cars and wore the finest clothes. She's not quite on the level as Tommy, but it is interesting that they tried to give her at least some kind of motivation. Sal himself has maybe the most depth out of everybody. During the course of Lincoln's dismantling of his organization, you'll see him cave and compromise on his beliefs, such as allowing the sale of heroin and being personally humiliated by Santangelo.
I'm building a casino across the lake. I had it all set up to get gambling legalized. Now it's all a goddamn mess.
You want my money.
We'll need to get to the governor, and it ain't gonna be cheap.
I want to hear you say it.
Say what?
That you want my money. Say those words, please.
I want your money.
This is good.
His organization and actual family are dying all around him, and at first it seems like the business losses are all that matters, but as the game goes on, you'll see how it affects him personally. At the very end of the game, when Sal sits at the top of his casino, his empire destroyed and his son dead by Lincoln's hands, is when we finally get some insight on his character. With Lincoln coming up the elevator instead of his son, he knows the end has come and chooses not to fight it. The conversation between Lincoln and Sal is my favorite part of the game, and one that encapsulates everything great about Mafia 3's presentation. The incredible motion capture work and acting, the nuanced writing, and the dramatic heft of its setting. I'm going to play this scene in full here because it's actually the scene that convinced me to play the game in the first place. Back in late 2016, I had seen the bad reviews and montages of glitches that followed the game's release. It was only after watching this scene that I realized that maybe the game had more to offer. Some would call that spoiling the ending of the game for myself, but the plot is not the strength of Mafia 3, it's the presentation. The incredible effort put into the writing and the performances is what gives the scene its power. It's quite a long scene, so if you've seen it already or don't want to sit through a few minutes of dialogue of a game that you haven't played, I totally understand, and there's a timecode on screen now to skip past this scene.
Hell of a sight, ain't it? When I first come to this town, it was nothing more than a backwater shithole. Now look at it.
Let me see your hands.
Whatever was between us is over, you understand? It ended the second it was you coming up them stairs instead of my son. You want a drink?
All right.
I had this imported from Scotland. Single malt. Now, usually I'm a bourbon man, but I figured I'd order something with a little more class for when the casino opened. Not much of a chance of that happening now, is it?
Don't look that way.
Take a seat. I ain't going nowhere. Hey, not bad.
I think I still prefer Shine.
You know, a month or so after my brother Lucio died, I started having nightmares. I had this one where I was on a boat. Giant wave come, knocked my ass overboard. I hit that water and sink like a goddamn rock. And there was another one where cottonmouths biting me all to hell. But the one that really got to me was Georgie's funeral. He's laid out in that shitty little casket. Neck cut, same as Lucio's. Yeah, that one really got to me. It'll come around again every 3 or 4 days.
And one where I'm back in Nam, sleeping in a foxhole. All of a sudden, these dark figures come out of the shadows. I try to fight them off, but they hold me down, tie my hands together, stuff a muddy rag in my mouth so I can't scream, can't warn the men sleeping next to me. And then I gotta listen as all those men die.
I would imagine that's not gonna go away anytime soon.
No. I imagine it won't.
And then this. This was all to try to keep mine from coming true. Look how that turned out. I buried a lot of people. More than I can count. The one I never wanted to see go down in that cold ground was my son.
And yet here we are.
Yes, sir. Here we are. My son is dead, and I'm having a drink with his killer. I'm not gonna apologize for what I did, you understand? If I did, I'd just be lying. I don't have it in me to feel shame for the things I've done to others. Never have.
Didn't come here for an apology.
Nah. I know you didn't. But goddamn, I was right about you, wasn't I? I knew it the second I fucking saw you at the country club. Men like us, we're just wired up wrong. There's only one thing we know. One thing we're good at. I'm gonna be waiting for you, Lincoln Clay. This won't be the last time we see each other.
I know.
What are you waiting for? Fucking do it.
It humanizes him without absolving him. Sal is still a terrible person. He's okay with killing people for being an inconvenience. He's okay with running drugs and sex and booze and even a body disposal racket. And most egregiously, he's okay with Remy Duval and the human trafficking racket. But it shows that terrible actions can spread from a genuine place. Sal actively dislikes being involved in crime and tries everything to get out. His mistake was that he thought he could betray everyone who worked with him and get away with it. After Sal's death, the game has one more blast from the past when Leo Galante shows up on behalf of the Commission to explain how things are going to work for Lincoln from this point on. Leo's willing to live and let live with Lincoln as long as he goes no further with his revenge. He gives him what sounds like a great deal. Run the city however you want. Drugs, women, guns, whatever. The only thing that matters to Leo is 20% for the Commission. There's one thing left to do. Either take over the rackets you've spent so much time cultivating or leave town. Donovan and Father James talk to Lincoln about his future and naturally have conflicting views. Lincoln's revenge is over, and Father James pleads for Lincoln to let it end here and move on with his life. Donovan, in his usual self, tells Lincoln to kill his 3 underbosses and take over the city himself. The thing is, when Leo Galante asks for his 20%, he's basically putting Lincoln in the same position Sammy Robinson was in, and when Donovan tells Lincoln to waste his underbosses, he's essentially asking him to become Sal Marcano. Isn't that exactly what Sal Marcano did? Recruit people to do a job, gain their trust, and then betray them for his own greed. The choice Lincoln has at the end isn't just about walking away or ruling over what the player has spent so much time building. It's asking the player which side of Lincoln the player chooses for him. Do you live up to Father James's words, or do you have the strength to move on? The best ending in my eyes is leaving town. Just like Vietnam before it, New Bordeaux brought out the monster inside Lincoln Clay, and the only way to contain that beast is to move on and try something new. The final drive is accompanied by Sympathy for the Devil by the Rolling Stones as the player passes Marcano's country club one last time where it all started. In the ending epilogue, depending on which underboss is the wealthiest, they will take over the city in your absence and either destroy all that promise with Cassandra or take it to where Sal always wanted with Vito. Vito finishes Sal's casino and finally gets to live his life at the top. Vito is no longer the fall guy, and now gets to fulfill the dream he started all the way back in Mafia 2. Lincoln is on the run and sends Father James postcards, but ultimately leaves his fate mostly ambiguous. It's a great ending. Even in its final moments, Mafia 3 refuses to wrap things up conventionally. Father James leaves the documentary in a moment both awkward and explicitly painful.
I think Lincoln wasn't able to accept the world for what it is, or his place in it.
There's also 3 story DLC packs released for the game following its release, and I want to briefly touch on those before we get into the outside influences. The first DLC, Faster Baby, is the best of the 3 in my view because it's the only one that feels like it takes place in the same stratosphere as Mafia 3's main game out of the 3. It explores the same kind of themes that Mafia 3 does, just with a completely new tone and gameplay style. It concerns a new area outside of New Bordeaux called Sinclair Parish, a more rural farming community led by a corrupt sheriff responsible for numerous racial crimes. The main addition is car chases, which basically don't exist in the main game outside of occasionally running from the cops. Its characters are over the top and the story is preposterous, but it works because the gameplay reflects the total shift in tone. About halfway through the DLC, you are introduced to a near indestructible car and are given free rein to tear up the center of town to provide a distraction, and it's glorious fun. Mafia 3's cars are generally very fragile, and after just a couple shots from pursuers will have popped tires and begin smoking in the engine to slow them down. To be given a car such as this feels like impossible freedom and excess. You can jump over whole buildings, plow right through fences and storefronts, all while taking a hail of bullets from pursuing police, with Roxy leaning out the side, spraying them with Uzi fire. It's a blast to play, and it works really well of shaking up the core gameplay into something a little less realistic and gritty, and something more over the top and silly. It's pretty short, but any longer and the tone probably would have started to grate a bit against the main game. As it stands, it's a short but thrilling and exciting ride that complements the main game very well. Faster Baby creatively took the same themes as Mafia 3 and tried to express them in a new way. Stones Unturned doesn't even seem to know what themes are, let alone how to express them in a new and interesting way. It is unfortunately the worst of the three, despite expanding on Donovan and Lincoln's genuinely good chemistry. The story is just unbelievably stupid and dumb, and it's just about the most jarring shift in tone in a DLC that I've ever seen. Mass Effect 3's DLC, Citadel, took Mass Effect 3's desperate and hopeless tone, and threw in a tongue-in-cheek adventure revisiting past characters and then allowing the player to throw a party, inviting almost every surviving character, all for a wonderful reunion right before the finale. It eased the player into its new tone. Stones Unturned feels like some aborted offshoot or attempt at a sequel, and it's just a mess. It's literally about Lincoln and Donovan trying to stop Donovan's old CIA nemesis from selling a stolen nuke to the NVA. Just Lincoln and Donovan, who is apparently still part of the CIA, but decides to take his old pal Lincoln for a rootin' tootin' adventure of stopping nuclear Armageddon. Not, say, inform his vast and powerful organization and maybe have them do something about it. No, just Lincoln and Donovan. You can't get much farther from Mafia 3 in terms of tone and subject matter. I get that the idea of story DLC is to try and do something different with the game engine and characters, but this is just so jarring in a way that Faster Baby never really managed. The writing is also uncharacteristically bad, foreshadowing a tragic event in Donovan's past that just turns out to be he just had a little tussle in an alley. No, seriously, the game puts so much emphasis on Donovan being afraid to tell Lincoln about it, and this is all it turns out to be. The DLC spends so much time on Lincoln and Donovan's banter and about them not taking the situation they are in seriously, but then in the end, it tries to be morally ambiguous and dramatic. Aldrich has a speech about how the US is just as bad as their enemies, and also has what I think might be a savage insult against a certain modern political figure.
Or maybe they find their girl humping on some fucking asshole who got a deferment for heel spurt.
Stones Unturned is a mess. Some of the locations are extremely detailed and beautiful, like a department store in Frisco Fields or the island in the game's finale, but the story and the tone are such a mess that it drags down the impressive production quality. It's worth playing to get this sweet jungle combat gear, but that's basically it. I thought wacky hijinks atop a turret-mounted jeep to stop a rogue CIA agent from selling nukes to the NVA was as far away in tone as a DLC could get from Mafia 3's main game. But the last DLC, Sign of the Times, takes that foolish expectation and smashes it to bits. This is the same game as Mafia 3. Yeah. Sign of the Times sees Lincoln investigating a cult of backwoods Satan worshippers who possess incense, which turns some segments into surreal dream sequences straight out of Batman Arkham or Max Payne. And it's True Detective.
Not at first, but right there in the last instant. It's an unmistakable relief. See, because they were afraid. And now they saw for the very first time how easy it was to just let go.
Like, even down to one-for-one copying direct scenes, just without all of the character development and grounded realism. But somehow, it still mostly works, although still being a tonal mess. The new detective mechanics are incredibly simplistic and shallow, but are really fun, and different to anything in the main game. There's a new enemy type that genuinely unsettled me a few times, of screeching, knife-wielding banshees who can take shots without being stunned, and... okay, they don't actually do much once they get up close, but fast sprinting enemies can be difficult to deal with Mafia 3's slow aiming. It also introduces slow-mo shooting, another nod to Max Payne, but this is used so little that it's barely even worth mentioning. The main thing the DLC gets right is its art direction. Occult imagery is something that isn't seen in games quite often, and this is some of the best that I've seen in a while. While most of this stuff works, the DLC could have been so much more. Bringing back detective mechanics makes me sad that there hasn't been a true open-world detective game where the player can follow their own leads and solve the crime scenes on their own. But no, Mafia 3 solves everything for you and points out exactly where you need to go. I wasn't expecting anything different, but it did remind me of how much we could be getting if someone was willing to make a true detective game. Sign of the Times is a notable increase in production value over the first two, being quite a bit longer than Faster Baby or Stones Unturned. It's also the first one to not take place in entirely new locations, but use unused locations around the main game world, which helps ground its fucking crazy story. This DLC, like Stones Unturned, is a tonal mess and squanders a lot of its potential. But unlike Stones Unturned, it's so weird and interesting that it somehow works. I will take inconsistently weird and interesting any day of the week over the bog standard story-based DLC tactic of a prequel or some adjacent event that has no meaningful impact to the main game. Now that all of the DLC has been released and the studio's fate is made public, it's difficult to say as an outsider if the game really did fail to meet 2K's sales expectations or if the layoffs to Hangar 13 are just part of an internal restructuring. But it certainly doesn't look good, and with seemingly no plans for a sequel in sight, it's reasonable to make the deduction that the game's performance, either critically or commercially, didn't please the higher-ups at 2K. In this section, I want to look at why this happened and what contributed to the overall poor reputation of the game online, and how it affected its performance. Mafia 3 is the poster child for how a bad launch can not only stunt a game's potential, but outright ruin its reputation altogether. Mafia 3 released with a ton of issues that I can't speak firsthand with because I didn't play the game until a couple months later, but even the briefest glance at early reviews or impressions revealed the numerous problems at launch. The biggest and most confusing being that the game released at 30 FPS. Now, I'm going to be candid with you for a second. I am the biggest frame rate whore you will ever know. I'm such a frame rate elitist that I won't play a game if it's capped at 60 FPS with some exceptions like Dark Souls, not 30. I have a 144Hz G-Sync monitor and I normally won't feel comfortable playing a game unless it's at least over 100 FPS, not 60. I honestly consider 60 FPS low. It's what kept me from playing Wolfenstein The New Order for years until someone finally made a mod that the game's own developers couldn't be bothered to make that unlocked the frame rate beyond 60. The ensuing mess that developed around the game's frame rate was completely pointless and arbitrary. This is not a case where players had to wait months or years for a working PC version to be released. The game was patched for a fully unlocked frame rate, not a 60 FPS cap, 2 days after release. 2 fucking days was enough to ignite a storm of bad Steam reviews and more conversations about the ethics of a 30 FPS cap on PC that persists to this day. Like I said, I would normally be all over this kind of practice, and while it was a strange and seemingly unnecessary decision, the fact that most players could not wait 2 days is so mind-numbingly ridiculous that it makes me question if Steam reviews should not unlock until a later date. Yes, the game should have released with a fully unlocked frame rate considering the amount of work it took to fix it, but the amount of ire this created from the PC gaming community is totally and completely unfair and unwarranted. Other problems extend to the visuals of the game, which suffered some complicated weather effects and poor texture work. Now, this is something that was unfortunately never truly fixed. The game's visuals have a number of problems, but still has the capacity to look truly beautiful under the right conditions. It's not quite a diamond in the rough as much as it is a diamond covered in grease. Quite literally, because the game's textures are brilliant, but covered with an abundance of post-processing effects that muddy up the overall image. I mentioned Wolfenstein: The New Order earlier, and coincidentally, that game remains the worst of this symptom that's so bad, I struggled to make out distant enemies. It's not quite that bad, but the game never looks as good as it could if it just let its textures shine through. It's sad when a game that's 10 years older still looks better, even with much lower quality textures, simply because those textures are at least clean and not covered in effects. The most revealing design problems in the game indicate to me pretty clearly that this game released way before it was really ready, and this is not something that I can blame on others just being impatient or unreasonable. Throughout the months following Mafia 3's release, it updated a ton of free content into the game that flat out should have been available at launch, and did huge damage to the game's overall reputation simply because of its absence. Staples such as customizable clothing and cars are such an expected feature in a game like this that the game feels totally sterile without them. Later on, Mafia 3 patched in numerous and varied outfits that give the game so much more variety. It's a simple thing, but changing the way the player character looks is huge to player identity and involvement. Car customization and races were also patched in much later, long enough to where I did not have them on my first playthrough, but it added a lot to my second, being able to color and customize my own personal car throughout the game.
The memes.
Next up, we have the glitches. Online culture nowadays is obsessed with memes, and I love them too. It's funny to reduce something down to its basest form and then provide quick and effortless humor that can be shared and understood easily. That sounds like an insult, but I'm being serious. Memes can fit into everyday life so easily because of how quick the humor is to get. But the memification of online culture has some very negative side effects that can backfire and damage properties like games, and Mafia 3 is a prime example. Once again, I have no first-hand experience on day one performance, but it's not difficult at all to find compilations of hilarious bugs and glitches that played the game on release. And I get it, sure, glitches are funny to look at, but this kind of thing has a danger to, especially an open-world game's reputation that does not actually reflect the quality of the product. Glitches in open-world games are expected. In a game with so much physical space and possibilities of unexpected player interaction, it's essentially impossible to eliminate all bugs from a game of this size with a modern production schedule and budget. The way that bugs can misrepresent open world games especially is that many players probably won't ever be able to trigger the action needed for a glitch or a bug that you'll see in funny videos online, which are, most of the time, compiled by players doing things that seem like deliberately trying to break the engine to record it. Now, this is not always true of these videos, as Krobcat's Mafia 3 quality control shows, which is mostly just playing the game normally and running into some absurd stuff, but it is something that I wanted to mention. The problem with these kinds of videos is that they are a permanent stain on the game's reputation, because even if the game fixes the bugs present, which the game mostly has at this point, this is the only major bug I encountered on my entire playthrough. And it's because I was overclocking my graphics cards so intensely that I was getting artifacting. Not even the game's fault. Nobody is going to make a follow-up video showing the game working in its normal state, and even if somebody does, it's never going to get as many views as the original glitch videos in the first place, because at that point, nobody's going to care. Everybody is just going to point and laugh and then move on without even remembering what game it was in the first place. Should the game have released without so many bugs in the first place? Absolutely. From the looks of it, it needed some serious work on release. Do I hate glitch videos and think they should all be taken down because they may be outdated or untrue to the experience of most players? Yes! Alright, I'm kidding, definitely not. But I do think that we should exercise a bit more skepticism on these types of videos than we normally do. It's too easy to point and laugh when it may not actually reflect the quality of the game it's portraying. Before you take a glitch compilation video as an accurate portrayal of the game's state, maybe look at the date and check it against any current updates to see if the game has addressed those issues. Try to find newer footage and check it against the old to see how things have changed and maybe improved. When you boil down everything Mafia 3 is to that game with the glitches lol, it ceases to be a piece of art or a product. It's now just a meme. Simple, funny, and easy to share with others. I mentioned this before, but it might be the most important reason why 2K ultimately decided to lay off so much of Hangar 13's staff, because by all accounts that I can find, the game still sold reasonably well. It was touted as the fastest selling game in 2K's history at around 4.5 million copies within the first week, which by AAA standards is very strong. Yet 2K doesn't seem to have any interest in a sequel or Hangar 13 as a studio moving forward. The only conclusion left to draw is that either there was some internal problems with the studio or that the game's critical reception was a primary factor in the decision. Mafia 3 bombed by traditional AAA standards, scoring a 62 on Metacritic with 22 mixed reviews from professional sites. I've already covered why I think the complaints of the gameplay are overly simplistic, so I'll just show a few excerpts here. Almost unanimously, reviews conclude that the story and soundtrack are the high points, but the gameplay squanders its potential. But this video has gone on long enough, and I'm not going to repeat myself here. I don't agree with the reviews and think they unfairly singled out Mafia 3 for problems that exist in nearly every game in the genre, and that Mafia 3 quite adeptly puts a new spin on. Nothing is worse than a great game that couldn't find its audience. Mafia 3 is nowhere near a perfect game, and that's not my intention with this video. It has bugs, it has misguided and lazy design decisions, and it's nowhere near as technically impressive as the newest Far Cry or Assassin's Creed. But what Mafia 3 has is something sorely lacking in a lot of AAA games. It has personality. It has a creative spark and the ambitions to see that creative vision all the way to the end. To me, any game, no matter how janky and awkward, that has a personality of its own is infinitely more valuable than a soulless artificial toy pre-approved in every aspect by some businessman to sell 50 more DLC packs and sequels. What happened to Mafia 3 should be a cautionary tale as to the devastating impact of a bad launch and the gaming press's impact on the internal workings of game developers. Mafia 3 is a game that I love, and my hope is that one day it'll be rediscovered, and maybe then you'll love it too.